Folks, white Latinos have fooled people for a long time. Today, no longer. We're going to have a conversation, and this conversation is going to span across a lot of topics. If you like commentary videos on YouTube about racism and culture and pop culture, I got you today. If you like conversations about history, I got you. Conversations about economics, conversations about political economy, about politics, elections. If you want to talk about Trump, we're going to talk about everything today. And the reason we're doing so is because in order to talk about Latin America, you have to talk about everything, especially to talk about this particular topic, which is racism. Racism in Latin America. Basically, we all know it's a problem, right? There's a lot of conversation, for instance, about Latin Americans voting for Trump or being Trump adjacent in the United States. And believe it or not, the right wing is also ascendant in different parts of Latin America as we speak, including one of Trump's great allies, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who, if you say a negative word about on YouTube, will send a flood of bots to you to talk about how safe it is now that everybody's arrested and in jail. I mean, I suppose if everybody's in jail, then I guess, in a way, nobody's committing crimes on the street. But anyway, let me not digress too much because we have a lot to cover. There's a lot of TikToks I have pulled up, so this is going to take a second. You may or may not know, but there are parts of Mexican TikTok that look like this. Mexicans from the USA? Yeah, whatever. Mexicans from Mexico are white, apparently. This is a conversation that we're going to have, okay? We're also going to have a conversation about things like this.
We like violence.
Mija, estás prietita.
No, Mom, I want to get my prietita right now, Mom.
I'm going to explain this really briefly. We'll revisit this later. This is a girl in a Latin American family who wants to have her hair lightened like her sibling or her relative, and her mother won't allow her because she's prietita. And she'll tell her later that she will look Indian, or she will look Indio if she does so.
Mom is always right.
No, she's not.
Vas a parecer,
I learned that the hard way.
vas a parecer India.
That's why, so let me dye my hair.
Shout out to that poor kid who's like, that's why, let me dye my hair. I want to look like that. The kids are trying, okay, but there's a lot to overcome. But a lot of the times we have conversations about Latin America and racism and white supremacy, and it's usually a conversation framed as colorism. It's a conversation framed as self-hate. Latin Americans are usually seen as people who are brown and tan, or have various degrees of lighter brown skin. And it's a conversation about adjacency to whiteness. Oh, so many Latin Americans want to be white. Well, I'm here to remind you, as is that page in Mexico apparently, which we will revisit, that a lot of Latin Americans are white. My grandma was white. As a matter of fact, they're not just white, they are descended from Europeans. And they will tell you that. They will tell you as much. Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. Based on the recent news that we're going to cover, there are certain people that aren't necessarily going to be fond of talking about their family affiliations. Regardless, when we talk about racism in Latin America, we actually do so in the United States with a very limited scope, a very limited understanding about history in Latin America, about the reason why racism is the way it is in Latin America, and how much it resembles what we have going on here. As a matter of fact, there are going to be some key revelations in this conversation that may or may not change how you think about geopolitics, change how you think about international politics, how the world works, how colonialism and imperialism work, change how you think about the US and Latin America forever. Yeah, so why don't we get into it? I will revisit some of the TikTok stuff later, but we're going to start with the news because you have to start with the news, right? Sorry, it's so boring, the news. It's always so depressing. Well, we've got to talk about it. Here's some news from Latin America that everybody's really excited about. Jose Antonio Kast has won the presidential election in Chile. And if you want to get a sense of whether or not that's a good thing or what that means in the grand scheme of things, maybe this title saying that Javier Milei, the libertarian far-right president of Argentina, which the United States and the Trump administration is sending billions of dollars to resuscitate their economy, as well as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States under Trump, are congratulating Jose Antonio Kast for his triumph in these elections.
A ir ahora con lo que ha publicado el secretario Marco Rubio. Dice felicitaciones, la traducción, felicitaciones al presidente electo de Chile, José Antonio Kast, por su victoria. Estados Unidos espera colaborar con su administración para fortalecer la seguridad regional y revitalizar nuestra relación comercial.
You know you're getting something good when the Trump administration is like, congratulations to the new president of Chile. This is going to be so great for our partnership, strengthening regional security and revitalizing our trade relationship. Well, who is Jose Antonio Kast? Who, by the way, if you believe in nominative determinism, if you believe in names having meanings subconsciously, you can't do better than the last name being Kast. Given what we're going to talk about today, if your name is Kast, it's just too on the nose, right? It's just too on the nose. Jose Antonio Kast is a far-right politician who has been, trying to win the presidency of Chile for a long time. Chile has been governed by several different center-left presidencies over the past couple of decades, as well as some turns to the right, notably with Sebastián Piñera. They had just had a center-left president, Gabriel Boric, very, very Latino name, Boric, who was previously associated with the socialist movement and student protests and became a pretty controversial and unpopular president because, spoiler alert, sometimes the center-left wins elections and then, they don't really deliver on their promises. I don't say this for all social democrats, but this is notoriously often the case because there's a lot of things one can promise, but it's very hard to deliver in a capitalist system. Regardless, back to Kast. Kast is far right. What does that mean? Well, he is very anti-immigration. He opposes abortion. He opposes same-sex marriage. He is going to prohibit the sale of the morning after pill. He has previously expressed open support for the right-wing dictator of Chile that led Chile post-US-led coup for several years. That's Augusto Pinochet. He's also very big on having a tough approach to crime. Now, Chile has always been one of the safer nations in Latin America, as this Al Jazeera article points out. But, we gotta come up with some reason to get people in a panic so that we can get them to vote far right. He's going to send the military to high crime areas and will build more prisons. Always just a good sign of a society on the up and up. And yeah, 63% of respondents said that security was a top issue for them in October, which was signaling that potentially this election was going to go a particular way. So that lets you know that the messaging was successful. The messaging was so successful, as a matter of fact, that it's gotten people to forget something very interesting about Jose Antonio Kast, which is, that he is the son of a Nazi. Yes, Jose Antonio Kast literally did the meme. His father was a member of the Nazi party. He fought for the Nazis because he was from Germany. More on this later, as far as Europeans being in Latin America. And for a time, this was leaked a few years ago, and for a time he would go out and he would talk about how, his father was actually forcibly conscripted into the Nazi military, and we are not our fathers, right? And I'd hate to be a leftist who gets bogged down into identity politics, talking about people's fathers and where they come from and stuff that their family has done or their predecessors have done, but not them. I would be a little bit more concerned about the truth of his brother. His older brother was actually a central bank president and a government minister in the early 1980s during the rule of said Augusto Pinochet, who, as a reminder, killed thousands of people, forcibly disappeared thousands of people, tortured thousands of people through Operación Cóndor. Now, some people will talk about Operación Cóndor as if it was just the United States military by itself single-handedly destroying Latin American democracy. But if you analyze what happened in Operación Cóndor and you understand what kind of class interests were behind Pinochet leading Chile after that coup, as well as, military dictatorship in Brazil, etc., then you'll understand that there are plenty of people in Latin America who benefit just as much from US imperialism as people in US. And that is a conversation we're going to be having. Again, I'm signaling things that we will talk about later. Regardless, your older brother doing that and you also having cozy relations talking about Augusto Pinochet, that's, neither here nor there. Let's talk about the fact that you are going to be your very own fascist. Somebody who, in the time period wherein there's been a lot of pressure from the US towards Venezuela, ships being shot down extrajudicially, and clearly in efforts to, imperialize Venezuela, which has long nationalized its oil resources, this is the kind of election that makes somebody like Donald Trump giddy with joy. Similar things were said actually about another recent president in Latin America, somebody whose profile was actually a lot bigger and in a lot of ways is pretty similar to Jose Antonio Kast, though in a lot of ways quite different. You might remember that a few years ago, Brazil had a president named Jair Bolsonaro, who recently has had a movie made about him. This is Jim Caviezel, who was once Jesus Christ in The Passion of the Christ, and as you know, has been doing far-right movies. Well, you might not know this. Far-right Christian movies for the past several years, including The Sound of Freedom, which is a terrible movie. Here are some Brazilians giddy to talk about how this film is going to represent Brazil or whatever.
Surpreendente a gente, do nada, receber imagens de Jim Caviezel como Jair Messias Bolsonaro. A gente estava até mais ou menos 2 meses atrás conversando sobre Paixão de Cristo 2 e Jim Caviezel retornando para interpretar Jesus. Aconteceu o que aconteceu, ele sai da produção, sai do filme, não será mais ele, e de repente ele vai ser Bolsonaro.
So they aren't exactly, explicitly praising this film, just talking about how interesting and crazy it is that Jim Caviezel's playing Jair Bolsonaro in a film. Of course, there are several people that are pulling up in the comments section. Esse filme vai ser sucesso, and all other kind of Brazilian right-wing stuff. Jair Bolsonaro, as you know, is also a white guy. He was the president of Brazil, and he was far right. He had a different stance on things like, for instance, immigration, because Brazil has historically been much more socially open to immigration. But being a raging homophobe and a raging anti-indigenous politician, is the kind of stuff that makes you an asset to the United States, especially to the Trump administration. The type of environmental damage that he did in the Amazon, which opened up to all types of illegal mining operations as well. The types of fake news that he spread and the type of cult of personality that he tried to foment, which has led to this film being produced starring Jim Caviezel and written by, interestingly enough, Mario Frias, who was once the Secretary of Culture under Bolsonaro. Gee, I wonder if there's a bias there. This kind of cult of personality is actually now in the down part. The downswing, at least according to reports from places like The Guardian, which talks about how Bolsonaro will now be starting a 27-year jail term for trying to throw a coup. There was a little rally that was held to talk about how unfair the sentencing was. It's not over. There's still so much Jair Messias Bolsonaro needs to do here in Brazil. No, it's not over. I have to think that you mentioned that his middle name is Messias because, why not compare your favorite far-right politician to Jesus if his middle name is literally Messiah? But otherwise, as opposed to what was happening between 2019 and 2023, wherein Bolsonaro was drawing huge rallies, impassioned crowds, the right-wing movement in Brazil has kind of been licking its wounds a little bit and contemplating what to do next after Bolsonaro has faced the full brunt of, Lula power, essentially, after, at one point throwing Lula in jail. Separate conversations for separate days. Of course, we're talking about Kast now, who defeated, by the way, the leading figure of the Communist Party in Chile, Janet Jara. This is part of a conservative wave in Latin America. Sometimes this is contrasted with the pink tide, which happened in Latin America in the 90s and 2000s, in which a lot of more center-left and left-wing politicians stood up to imperialism a little bit in their rhetoric and sometimes in their policy and won elections throughout Latin America. I'm talking about people like Evo Morales. I'm talking about people like Hugo Chavez. Now there is a bit of a backlash to that. Oh yeah, a link to Anna notes that Bolsonaro would actively tell people to take the wrong meds during the pandemic. His handling of COVID-19 was a disaster. The Congress voted to reduce the sentence to 2 years, I think. Is that so? I mean, I'm not finding the info on that, but I wouldn't be terribly surprised by that, is what I'll say. As you might know, also in Bolivia, another white man who is a right-wing politician won the presidency, displacing the MAS electoral wing. Luis Arce was part of MAS. Kind of just failed pretty epically on Mas's behalf. A lot of infighting going on there. Jorge Quiroga was actually a more centrist candidate that lost to Rodrigo Paz. So this is not the first time, is essentially what I'm trying to tell you. Over the past 10, 15 years, right-wingers have found some momentum in Latin America. One of those right-wingers is actually not exactly the kind of person that you would expect them to look like. You would think of a white guy like Bolsonaro or Paz or Kast. But sometimes very light-skinned mestiza women are also part of this same imperialist movement in Latin America. I'm talking, of course, about Maria Corina Machado, who recently had a very noble, very scary, very amazing trip to Norway where she fractured her vertebra. She is the Nobel Peace Prize winner of 2025, of course, and the opposition leader to what we know know as the dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. Now, we're not here to talk about Venezuelan politics in depth. There are a lot of left-wing critiques of Nicolás Maduro. There's a lot of things to say about the way he's handled elections, the way he's handled capitalism in the country. But if we're talking about people who are going to bring Venezuela into a better place, who really care about the interests of Venezuelans, especially the many brown and black Venezuelans, Maria Corina Machado is not exactly that type of person. Here she is with the Nobel Prize. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work promoting democratic rights for the people of Venezuela. She managed to make the difficult and dangerous trip from Venezuela to Norway, arriving yesterday in Oslo to receive her Nobel Peace Prize. Here she is with the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee. The Nobel Peace Prize winner is actually really into war. She's really into the United States putting military pressure on Venezuela, and in fact, one can say invading Venezuela to force out the president who was, by many counts, although it's been some dispute, democratically elected and has previously been democratically elected multiple times, according to internationally recognized elections. Maria Corina Machado doesn't stop there, though. Maria Corina Machado is an advocate of popular capitalism. She is really big on privatizing state-run entities in Venezuela, especially Petróleos de Venezuela, the state-owned oil and natural gas company. She is openly anti-communist. She called Javier Milei, again, the fucking weirdo guy that Elon Musk is obsessed with, she called his victory of the presidency in Argentina a triumph in the fight for change and freedom in Latin America. She's a big Trump supporter, okay? And I thought this was really funny. When Trump was nominated, apparently, for the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was in a runoff with Maria Corina Machado, Redditors were like really into Machado winning. They were like, yeah, hope Trump loses, of course, and this Machado person seems like she's fighting for democracy and she's a woman and it's very woke, very cool. And then she won and Redditors celebrated for about 5 hours before later seeing that she had thanked Trump and said that he deserved to win it just as much, and they were like, that's kind of weird. Yeah, it turns out that imperialists aren't your friends. It turns out that they're not exactly revolutionaries, are they? Also, she's super pro-Israel. She's super Zionist. Jose Antonio Kast, incoming president of Chile, is super Zionist. That's actually kind of unique and important because in Chile, there's a huge Palestinian community, the largest one outside of the Middle East. So kind of a significant development there. So all these people are Zionists. All these people are pro-imperialist, and they do so because they are collaborating with European and American politicians to steal Venezuelan oil and to profit from it in the West. I showed this in a previous conversation. There was a Polish politician talking about Venezuela tonight. You have been warned, with these weird looking fighter planes. And people were confused. Why are Polish politicians hyping up the US attacking Venezuela? Then this journalist Heidi Moore, who was previously the finance and econ editor for The Guardian, the US, noted that the purpose of invading Venezuela is to steal its oil, and that this is a pan-European project led by Norway. The European Parliament is eager for it because too much of Europe is dependent on Russian resources, and they would love to steal it off from another country. That's what Moore said. She noted that Venezuela closed its embassy in Norway after Norway gave this fascist Machado a Nobel Prize. As you know, Norway is the country that gives out the Nobel Peace Prizes. So it's interesting that they're also the ones that are really hype about getting Venezuelan oil. And again, a quick summary before we finally move away from politics. This is for those of you who have borne with me or who didn't skip ahead to talking about more juicy stuff. Thank you. Heidi Moore describes exactly what this is. The Russia-Ukraine war has made Norway an important global political player because it has oil reserves. Norway wants to get control of more oil markets to consolidate its newfound power, and that includes Venezuela's. Maduro stands in the way because he nationalized Venezuela's fossil fuel production, closing it off to corrupt outsiders. Machado, who is deeply corrupt and stupid, has based her revolutionary sentiments on overthrowing Maduro and opening up Venezuela to foreign drilling operations. European energy companies are constantly trying to get rich by stealing resources from other countries. See the gas fields off Gaza, which have been divvied up by a bunch of scrofulous fossil fuel CEOs and enriched Israel while it genocides Palestinians. All those corrupt European politicians in the European Parliament in various countries want to get bribes for giving Venezuelan oil contracts to their fossil fuel-backed donors. They want the bribes. So that's the whole thing. Resources exist in place. Country that lives in place and nation that lives in place wants to have control of those resources. Big empires outside of place want those resources instead. So they exert all of this pressure. Sometimes that pressure is cultural. And that's where we have to talk about social racism in Latin America. The conversation that I think a lot of people were expecting when you see a title like this and expecting from my intro. This is a huge part of the conversation. Everybody knows that Latinos are racist. They have a serious colorism issue. They have a serious white supremacy issue. They have a serious issue with preferring certain hair types and skin types. And they have serious issues with being anti-black and anti-indigenous. And a lot of times this is framed as, oh yeah, Latinos are so self-hating. But if you look at it, a lot of the time it's not really self-hate. Sometimes it is, because you have brown people that are competing over who is browner than the other. But in a lot of cases, these are just Europeans. Like these Europeans here, Mexicans from Mexico. What you're seeing are actually Mexicans from particular parts of Mexico that are well off. And that's why they look and dress and act, if you know them, they act exactly like white Americans living in Brooklyn or in Utah, like in Provo and shit. Shout out to the one chatter who's in Utah. This is a TikTok account called Mexican Upper Class that, loves to show these types of Mexicans off. There's also some brown ones that get showcased in here, but you'll notice that the vast majority of them are white. And we call these fresas, right? These are fresas argentinas, which, oh boy, we're gonna get into Argentina too. Fresas are essentially, according to Mexican slang, the upper class and rich, usually white, usually almost always lighter skin mestiza as well, if mestiza, young women that party, that buy expensive bags, and that speak like, mi pops, güey, mi pops dice que yo no puedo salir hoy, pero me voy a salir. They say things like that. By the way, I should note that for anybody who's gotten this far and is wondering, why is this guy speaking, Spanish so well? And what does he think he knows about Latin America? I've lived in Latin America. I'm Dominican. I have a video about my ethnic origins. Just for your information. Now, these dynamics happen because we have dynamics in Latin American culture and society that are dominantly colorist and white supremacist, and they do so very tacitly and very subtly. Sometimes you see this in the case of the types of musicians and entertainers, types of actors, public figures that you see getting praise from Latin America. Whether it is a quote-unquote peace activist like Maria Corina Machado, who is very, very, very light-skinned mestiza, or whether it's entertainers like J Balvin, who a couple of years ago did a music video with Afro-Dominican demboista, Toquicha, wherein, and she encouraged this. He had black women on leashes. J Balvin is a white guy from Medellin. But think about, other Latino entertainers. Think about Shakira. Think about somebody who's light-skinned mestizo, like Jennifer Lopez or Bad Bunny. Think about Karol G. These are the kinds of artists that are always getting popular attention and crossover appeal from Latin America. It is very rarely the black and indigenous artists that comprise huge swaths of the population of Latin America and often are the pioneers of the genres, especially in the case of Afro-Latinos like Tego Calderon, who was very pro-black and who was one of the forefathers of the reggaeton burst of popularity, made some of the greatest records of all time in that genre. But people don't think about Tego Calderon when they think about reggaeton in the United States. They think about Daddy Yankee, they think about J Balvin, and they think about Bad Bunny now, who has, to his credit, done a lot of work to highlight injustice in Puerto Rico, to highlight people of different backgrounds, to highlight queer issues, but at times is also pretty complicit in benefiting from that kind of look, that kind of colorism, that kind of privilege, and sometimes doesn't recognize it quite as much as we'd like him to. That's a conversation I'll have in a future video. Stay tuned for that. Regardless, it's not just in the music, right? I saw one TikTok like this. Why do white Latinos claim to be non-white, but when it comes to indigenous people, they belittle their non-whiteness? This is an experience that a lot of people have had. Right? And I think this gets at exactly what the problem is. There's a lot of Latinos that benefit from white supremacy, benefit from Eurocentrism, and benefit from colorism. And at the same time, sometimes on the left, will also align themselves as the oppressed, but won't necessarily align themselves with the oppressed. Maria Corina Machado is a great example. And this is because these people are very European. The reality of Latin America is that it is a very European project. Let's also take a look at what, Latin Americans say in their own countries, right? Like the notorious Argentina, which sometimes the hate is undeserved, but a lot of times it is deserved, and there could be more hate. Argentinians will even acknowledge it.
¿Crees que Argentina es un país racista?
Yo creo que un poco sí, si te soy sincero. No.
¿Por qué?
Hay gente racista, pero
No significa que toda la Argentina
sea racista.
No sé si es que Argentina es un país inherentemente racista, pero sí creo que la gente suele tener ciertas actitudes racistas.
La verdad que sí. Si bien creo que son más racistas con algunas nacionalidades que otras.
Creo que acá hay mucho más clasismo que racismo, pero el clasismo está atravesado por el racismo.
What this lady has just said is actually really important because a lot of times we look at classism as if it is completely inextricable from race. We look at class struggle as if it's completely inextricable from struggle against white supremacy. But understanding the history of Latin America, you can see how deeply classism is a conversation about race. In fact, Latin America is the best example of this in a lot of ways because, as another Chilean TikToker has pointed out, a lot of the founding myths about class and about identity in Latin America are based on racist ideals, as well as ideals of European advancement. So this is someone named Williams Alegría on TikTok.
¿Tú crees que los chilenos no se dan cuenta de dónde viene ese clasismo tan metido en el cuerpo? Que no.
He asks, do you think Chileans don't know where that classism comes from so deeply in their body?
¿Notan cuando alguien dice flojo porque es mapuche? ¿De verdad crees que eso nació solo? ¿Y qué vas a...?
That somebody might say something is, flojo is kind of like low class because it's mapuche. Flojo means lazy here. Okay, thanks, Danae. Yeah, flojo means lazy. I don't know why. I mixed up my words sometimes, but flojo also means lazy in DR. Mapuche is an indigenous group. We will talk about them a little bit. That was and has been the subject of ethnic cleansing for a long time in Latin America. You also have conversations in Colombia, right? The place where J Balvin is from, and Shakira is from, and Karol G is from. People who look a certain way and say parce, and drink coffee, and eat arepas and shit. Colombia is actually an extremely diverse country, and that diversity is very segregated. That diversity is concentrated in different places. And so in a place like Medellin, you have a lot of white people like J Balvin, and yet they benefit from having this Colombian identity and this identity as spicy Latino, despite the fact that the spice and the music and the art and the culture and the land actually belongs to the indigenous people and the African peoples who were kidnapped and forcibly brought to Colombia. And a lot of Colombians will tell you about their experience with racism in Colombia, like this one creator. Her name is Chris Ebony.
Yo tengo 24 años y el choque de realidad más grande que yo he vivido en los últimos tiempos es aceptar y darme cuenta de que en mi país sí existe el racismo y que está muy marcado.
She says, one of the things that I've had to accept over time is that my country is very racist and it's very notable. Like, it's very, entrenched.
Bueno, yo vivo más que todo en Medellín y eso está demasiado marcado. Las mujeres negras aquí somos muy sexualizadas y muy cosificadas.
Black women in Medellin, are very sexualized and very commodified. And so it's very notable in Medellin among other places, or Medellin. I keep saying Medellin because I keep thinking about white Latinos and how they say shit. Somebody who's from Brazil is in our chat and was just mentioning this earlier. We have a Brazilian creator talking about the exact dynamics that we just talked about in Colombia existing in Brazil. Oh, somebody asked her, what does racism in Brazil look like, and does it vary from state to state?
It does, and it's historically explained, okay? Just to make it easier, this is the Brazilian map, and we are here. I am here, actually, in Rio de Janeiro, the state, okay? This purple area is the south of Brazil. The pink area is the southeast. Here in orange is the northeast of Brazil. Here is like our kind of Midwest. I don't know, it's Midwest, the name in yellow. And up here, all this green area is the north region of Brazil. It's important to explain this because down to the south of Brazil, some people, I'm not telling that everyone there, okay? They think they are Europeans. Really? Just because their granny or their grandpa, they were from, Poland, from Germany. They are all think they are German and Polish or French or Italian as well. But they are all Brazilian. And if you say to them, oh no, you're not German, your grandma is German, they kind of collapse. And it's a really racist area because, they think their last name is different. They're better than the rest of Brazil. But if I go there to one of these German people and talk to them in German, like, wie geht es Ihnen? Ich heiße Stella, ich bin 33 Jahre alt. They are not going to understand me because they don't even speak the language.
Now, this is a really funny observation, and it is something that every Brazilian will tell you is the case. And this is, in fact, the group of people that predominantly support Bolsonaro and right-wing politicians in Brazil, as well as efforts to continually take land from indigenous people to use for different businesses. And what's interesting about these European Brazilians is that in a lot of ways they're not wrong. She's obviously making fun of them because they don't even speak the language of their patrias. They don't even really have that much connection to the European culture that they will claim. But they got last names like Schwartz, or they got last names like, you know, people in the chat put Italian last names in the chat. Let me know. I'm blanking on Italian last names right now. Bella. I don't know. I forgot everything Italian that's ever existed. But they are European. They're European in that they have arrived on behalf of European settlement, and they've held on to their European identity, not because they care about the language, not because they care about Lederhosen. Russo, okay, Mangione, good one. Not because they care about Europe all that much to begin with, but because it means something to be connected to Europe and Latin America. Latin America has been settled by white people for a time, and those white people have often, historically, been the ones who have power and who have exercised that power over others to model different parts of Latin America to a European image. Now, this doesn't just apply to the white Latinos, who, again, we're going to get more into settlements later on. This also applies to the many Latin Americans who are on the different parts of the, racialized spectrum, but who have been convinced by this entrenched Eurocentrism that European beauty ideals, European art ideals, European class ideals from high-class Europeans, right, are the thing to seek in life. They are the pinnacle of success. And this entrenched messaging makes it so that so many aspects of mestizaje, so much of the mix that you have with indigeneity and blackness in Latin America is both wielded as a type of benefit when it benefits people, and also demeaned and ostracized. We have long entrenched beauty ideals, for instance, about your nose being too big, about you being too dark, about you having indigenous features or black features, you having, too curly hair. And there is constant reinforcement, often brutal reinforcement within the Latin American family, both in and outside of Latin America, to avoid those features. So that brings us back to this TikTok, which I'll show you more of now. This is really devastating. Nobody in this TikTok would be unilaterally considered white. The mother is clearly pretty light skinned, and there has probably been some very deeply entrenched stuff for her about what that means. But everybody in this video is suffering from white supremacy, and there are non-white people perpetuating it. It's so common.
I want my hair to be like violence.
Mija, estás prietita.
No, Mom, I want to hair my prietita or not, Mom.
Khaleesi, come here. Khaleesi, come here. Khaleesi, come here.
It's my decision.
You're recording.
It's my decision. Oh, yeah, that's pretty. Can I go blonde?
It's gonna wash you out so bad.
Care.
No, I care. I'm not gonna let you do
No,
that.
stop, please.
Mom is always right.
No, she's not.
Vas a parecer.
I learned that the hard way.
Vas a parecer India.
That's why, so let me dye my hair.
You are like an Indian.
Yeah?
Camelia, you can go blonde. I feel like it would suit you.
Camelia.
No! A loser.
Why are you crying? You're not gonna dye your hair. Estás loca. No te voy a dejar hasta que tengas 15 años. Es más.
Mom, you're letting Camelia dye her hair blonde
Because she's lighter.
This is a video that had 2.3 million likes on TikTok when captured in this other video. And probably a lot of backlash, but also a lot of people finding this funny, finding this relatable, maybe even agreeing with the mom and the sister who is, really in that process of entrenching these ideals. You can't have this light hair color because you're not light skinned. And if you have lighter hair, you will look darker and your Indio features will come out more. This is very common, especially in specific parts of Latin America where there are sordid histories with indigenous people. Read basically every part of Latin America.
Mom, you're always letting everybody, you're literally choosing black girl. First of all, you choose one as your baby.
You saw in that video is unfortunately something that is very common in many Latino households. Our parents raise us to be very, very colorist. Quick story time, and I'll say it in Spanish because I know a lot of people don't believe that I'm Latina. Era el verano antes de mis 15 y mi mamá me dijo, no te me vas a salir porque te vas a poner prieta y quiero que te veas bonita para tus 15.
So yeah, she's gonna explain it, but yeah, she has shared a story about her mom telling her not to go out in the sun before her quinceañera because she's gonna get dark and you have to look pretty for your quinceañera. I can't tell you how common this is. How common, words like prieto, prietito, prietita are used. It's all about like, oh, is this person gonna look darker in the sun? Like so much of that. You look too dark right now, especially for women. Especially for women who have to uphold the beauty ideal so stringently, to use a big word. Being darker is just like super off. It doesn't work with the beauty ideal. It doesn't work with the beauty standard. Thankfully, with Gen Z and with the internet and with the rise of certain progressive ideals, some of this is changing. But especially from, whenever, Latin Americans develop as an identity in the 19th and 20th centuries to like the mid 2000s, early 2010s, late 2010s, and as you can see, still to different degrees now, this has been very common. This is the thing that I think a lot of people see as predominant racism and colorism in Latin America. This is what people see it as, right? They think of it as these brown people who are convinced to avoid being dark-skinned, to avoid having ethnic features, and to fight for a European beauty standard. They're convinced that that is the way to go, and a lot of people see that as the way racism manifests in Latin America and don't see anything outside of that. But as we just talked about, in Latin America, there are all types of different forms of racism and all types of white people living there. I will return to those other TikToks later, but I want to get to this part, right? I can't stop with this account, this Mexican upper class account. This one is described as the it girls of Mexico, and the description says real fresas. Gosh, I just can't. There's something very similar about these ladies. I just can't say what it is. There's like a feature that they have. Something about maybe their hair, maybe it's their eye. I don't know what it is. This is like 90% if you froze it and you took the description away and I told you that this is a side character on the Real Lives of Mormon Wives, you'd be like, yeah, that sounds good. She's friends with Jesse or something. That's what's going on here. This is the it girls of Mexico. And there are people who really think this way, who really think that these European descended Mexicans, as well as people across Latin America who are predominantly upper class, are the ideal of Mexico and want to promote that in order to promote these Latin American countries, to say, see, look at how beautiful they are. See, look at how diverse we are, wink. Look at how much culture is here and how much money is here, right? So let's talk about money, because I think for those of you who are more interested in conversations about class struggle, more interested in conversations about capitalism, a lot of this stuff might ring familiar to you, but it might just come off as something ephemeral, something that is not super duper important. But what you see with a video like this about real fresas in Mexico is a hint as to what exactly is going on here with these Europeans in Latin America. But in case you don't get the hint, let me make it a little bit clearer for you. Here's an article from Forbes about the 10 richest people in Latin America in 2024. And you're going to notice some things, okay? You're going to notice some things. Let's start with Ricardo Salinas Pliego. This man is worth $13.4 billion as of 2024. He is from Mexico. This is him, okay? Not the most dark-skinned person, not exactly, racially ambiguous, right? Salinas Pliego was the billionaire in 2021 who faced a lot of controversy because his company's workers kept dying, facing deadly conditions, violating Mexico's pandemic rules. Top of the line exploitative Mexican who had no regard for lockdown, no regard for COVID and security. Although I know a lot of y'all don't really have a place to speak off of other people being not COVID secure because a lot of y'all won't mask, but that's a separate conversation. He posted a picture saying, "How's your #weekend going?" on Twitter, showing his 163-foot luxury yacht bobbing around the Sea of Cortez. Oh, look at this. Classic. We just let dogs keep barking. It's a signal that we are walking. And showing a gif of him rubbing his face with money. This is the 7th richest person in Latin America. What about number 6? Jorge Paulo Lemann. $16.4 billion in net worth. Source of wealth? Beer. Citizenship? Brazil. Real Brazilian name that Lemann is, right? Along with Herman and Sicopira, Lemann is a shareholder of Anheuser-Busch InBev, producer of Budweiser, Michelob Ultra, and Stella Artois beers. Through their private equity firm 3G Capital, they also own stakes in Restaurant Brands International, parent of Burger King and Canadian coffee chain Tim Hortons. These are people that are in Brazil that have power over you. You in the West, right? These are people that own part shares of things that you buy. You're sitting here thinking about all these American billionaires and European billionaires and, all this Western billionaire stuff. Good that you're thinking about that. Just remember that some of those Western billionaires are also in Brazil. And I do say that they're Western because, as you might guess from his last name, Jorge Paulo Lemann is Swiss. He was born in Rio de Janeiro to a Swiss father, and he's become this international hero among rich people, by the way. His $26.3 billion net worth is self-made, so they say. His growing fortune has recently overtaken that of oil tycoon Eike Batista on the rich list by Forbes Brazil. This is Eike Batista, by the way. He made and lost a $1 billion fortune in mining and oil and gas industries. And his father is Eliezer Batista, who is of Portuguese descent. It's so strange that all these people are white and from Europe, and they're also the richest people in Latin America. Vicky Safra, Iris Fompona. Some of these folks, to be fair, are not European, but most of them are. We'll stop with number 2, Eduardo Saverin. You remember him from The Social Network, that movie? You remember when he was played by Andrew Garfield?
Sorry, my Prada's at the cleaners! Along with my hoodie and my fuck you flip-flops, you pretentious douchebag!
He's worth $28 billion as of last year. He had a particular controversy that was interesting. He was doing tax avoidance. This is an opinion piece actually from Forbes praising him for doing tax avoidance. He gave up his US citizenship and then moved to Singapore so that he could stop paying as many taxes. Eduardo Saverin is Romanian. His grandfather was from Romania, and he is also one of these Latinos who is white as snow. And again, just seems like an awfully weird coincidence, except when you think about the wider scope of the issue. The fact that in Latin America, there is a huge inequality problem. And you probably know that, right? You probably know that there's a huge inequality problem in Latin America because some people are rich and some people are poor. But you may not also know that most of those rich people are white and most of those poor people are brown and black. Pretty similar to the United States. Isn't that interesting? So here's a paper, one of many, this is from 2025, examining this issue. Strangely enough, this issue has gone pretty under-examined, it notes, but it lets you know that the region's black and indigenous populations are disproportionately among the poorest in contemporary Latin America, almost without exception, and are largely absent among the middle and upper classes. That's really weird. And I'll just also look at this quick passage from the conclusion after, it describes all the measures and data sources that it looked at from 20 countries within the region, illustrating the vast diversity in racial composition, because race is also kind of confusing and fluid in Latin America. It's also confusing and fluid in the United States, but Latin America in particular has a lot of racial categories, especially differing from country to country, that a lot of people might not know about. Regardless, the investigation into skin tone yielded the most uniform evidence for a racial hierarchy across nearly all countries in the region. There is a clear positive correlation between lighter skin color and higher SES throughout Latin America, with few exceptions. This pattern led to the characterization of Latin America as a pigmentocracy, where individuals with lighter skin tones are predominantly at the top of the social hierarchy and those with darker skin are at the bottom. And I think this sounds like it might be this very complex thing, but in reality, when you look at this data and this evidence and these conclusions, it's not that complicated. It's not even that complicated for somebody from the US to understand, because it's pretty similar here. Even among the different racial categories here, people who have lighter skin tones are disproportionately the ones among their ethnic groups to have the most wealth, to have the most privilege within the cultural society, within class society, etc. And so white supremacy has always reared its head in not just white people having all of the wealth, but also the lightest among different ethnic populations having the most wealth within them. So where's the money in Latin America? What's with all this poverty and inequality? Well, you might want to start looking at white Latinos for your answer. And of course, I have to know here that there are poor white Latinos, there are working class white Latinos, there are middle class white Latinos. Some of my best friends are white Latino. I told Danae I was going to say this. Some of my friends are white Latino. I've got family members who are white Latino. And in fact, some of the most important figures of 20th century Latin America who have had left-wing politics, who have fought on behalf of the oppressed across racial categories, are white people. I think of Lolita Lebron in Puerto Rico. I think of Paulo Freire in Brazil. I think of Enrique Dussel. I think of Che Guevara, right? Regardless, all of those people would probably not be ignorant to the fact that whiteness is dominant in Latin America in a way that once you see it, you can't unsee. You can't unsee it. So let's talk about historically what the reason for that might be. And this is where I drop a truth bomb. Okay, are you guys ready for the truth bomb? I've had a white Latino over to my house for dinner. Yeah, Forbes is not a good publication. If you want to learn about finance, just look at Financial Times. Even Wall Street Journal is better than Forbes. Forbes is just write-ups, like kiss-ups for whoever pays enough. I should talk about Carlos Slim. Carlos Slim, really briefly, is of Middle Eastern descent, I think Lebanese. And yeah, he's one of those people that got rich in the mid 20th century after, working basically like a Warren Buffett figure, and then owned a lot of different properties across a lot of different industries. And some of these folks are Middle Eastern. You have well-to-do or middle class or working class Middle Easterners who moved to Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries who also built fortunes there. But the vast majority of who we see as, and even among those Middle Easterners, right, it's usually light-skinned Middle Easterners, very light-skinned Middle Easterners, in fact. Yeah, the Forbes list is useful for what I was talking about. Richest president in Latin America, also Lebanese. Current president of the Dominican Republic is Lebanese, and he's white. White Middle Easterners, that's a thing. White Arabs, to be clear. Okay, so let's do the truth bombs. What historically could potentially be the cause for, all this pigmentocracy in Latin America? Similar to that discussion, the answer is not that different from the story you already know. Many people have talked about settler colonialism in the past year or two. They've talked about it as a predominant force of capitalism and colonialism around the world. And they've talked about the United States being a settler colony, which is true. They've also talked about Australia being a settler colony, which is true. And of course, people have talked about Israel being a settler colony, which is of course true. Historically, South Africa, another good example. But you know what doesn't get talked about as a settler colony? 90% of Latin America. Yes, from Colombia to Argentina to Chile, from parts of Central America. You could argue Mexico. You can absolutely argue Mexico, El Salvador. Latin American countries are predominantly settler colonies. Predominantly. And Lydia points out one part of this that I think is important. But there's actually a really important second part. So firstly, we all know that Latin America was colonized predominantly by Spain. Very clear. Also colonized by Portugal, very notably in Brazil. And yes, that has a huge influence on, for instance, the eradication of many indigenous peoples. We all know about what Columbus did, Hernan Cortés, etc. That has a huge part to play in, of course, most people in Latin America speaking Spanish, having Spanish names, even when they have indigenous ancestry, much less the many people who don't have indigenous ancestry or who are mestizo. Mestizaje is the blend of usually white, European, Spaniards with indigenous folks of the Americas, as well as sometimes black folks. That's what mestizaje is. But what happened in the 19th century in Latin America, which was well after the initial conquest of Latin America by Spain and after Spain lost several territories throughout Latin America, or was beginning to lose them. Throughout the 19th century, a new settler colonialism began, one that Latinos don't talk to you about. In fact, most Latinos don't know about, don't really understand. It wasn't just Spain who colonized us. Spain colonized us, got their asses kicked eventually by other Europeans in the Americas, and then other Europeans settled in the Americas to colonize the indigenous and black peoples of the Americas again. That's the story that they don't tell you. This is something I'll talk about in my eventual video essay about Bad Bunny. It's a conversation that I had with the executive producer of this program, Earth Janelli, when she talked about going to cultural festival events in university or in high school, and people will put on productions showcasing the cultures of their ancestry, the cultures of their patria, their home nation. And the Latin American countries, from Ecuador to Colombia to Venezuela to Puerto Rico to Dominican Republic to Mexico sometimes, Argentina to Chile, will show up, these students will show up and do a presentation, and it will be by and large the same presentation. We eat empanadas. We do salsa. Isn't it great? Which is so interesting because it's not a conversation about the land. It's not a conversation about indigeneity. It's not a conversation about history. It's not a conversation about politics. Certainly not. It's always a conversation about, guys, we have salsa. Oh, we eat meat and we put salsa verde on it. So many Latinos in the United States have no education about what Latinidad even is, what the histories of their nations even are, and why they are the way that they are. So today we're going to unpack in particular that 19th and 20th century settler colonial project that happened throughout Latin America to reveal the fact that, like the United States, most of these Latin American countries are settler colonies. They have been imperialized by the United States, sure, but A lot of times when those settler colonies are imperialized by the United States, it is the settlers in those Latin American countries that actually benefit and that actually are the ones doing it. So they're not doing it to their own people. It's just like Israel and Palestine. They were doing it to another people. They were treating Latin America as a land without a people. For not even a people without a land, just a people who wanted to come up. And they exterminated as much of the indigenous populations as they could. That is the history of Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that is the reason behind all of this racial politic we see today. This was talked about, I think, popularly for the first time in the late 2000s by a journalist named Richard Gott from England, who was doing journalism about, for instance, the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in the late 90s, as well as coverage of Evo Morales in Bolivia in the 2000s. And he talked about how there's a white settler elite in Latin America that is predominantly against these, social democrats' elections and these pro-indigenous movements. In this one article he wrote, Latin America is traditionally seen as a continent set apart from colonial projects elsewhere, the outcome of its long experience of settlement since the 16th century. Yet it truly belongs in the history of the global expansion of white settler populations from Europe in the more recent period. Today's elites are largely the product of the immigrant European culture that has developed during the 2 centuries since independence. The settlers expropriated the land and evicted or exterminated the existing population. They exploited the surviving indigenous labor force on the land. They secured for themselves a European standard of living, and they treated the surviving indigenous peoples with extreme prejudice, drafting laws to ensure they remained largely without rights as second or third class citizens. The same kind of logic you can apply to Israel and Palestine right now is the same exact logic that created the modern day Latin America. Even that term, Latinidad, it's a bit of a dispute. Where did Latin America first emerge as a term? Was it in this use by, a French presenter to talk about the potential of Latin America, the Americas outside of the US as a place for European settlement? Was it something that was proposed by one Chilean scholar in defense of the Americas, in defense of what would be Latin America against, Yankee settlement? It's a bit of a controversy, but by and large it was a controversy that still was dominated by whites, Europeans, who used the term Latin because it came from the Latins, the Latin languages, the Romance languages, which, make up the majority of Latin America in terms of who colonized them. Spanish, as well as, some connection with Italian, some connection with French. So Latinidad in itself is a concept that a lot of people don't really fit into, is it? If it's a concept describing this descended from European people's population and culture in this part of the world, then black folks throughout Latin America and indigenous folks throughout Latin America are not welcome as part of that project. Makes sense why you get J Balvin, right? And not Tego Calderon. He goes on to talk about a lot of interesting stuff, and not just this journalistic article, but also in this really good academic piece, Latin America as a White Settler Society. I'll just read a couple other choice lines before I move on to the conclusion part of this segment. More or less. I have a lot of stuff to talk about still, so it's not going to be that quick. In Venezuela, elections in December will produce another win for Hugo Chavez, a man of black and Indian origin. Indian meaning indigenous, right? Much of the virulent dislike shown towards him by the opposition has clearly been motivated by race hatred, and similar hatred was aroused in the 1970s towards Salvador Allende in Chile and Juan Perón in Argentina. Allende's unforgivable crime in the eyes of the white settler elite was to mobilize the rotos, the broken ones, the patronizing and derisory name given to the vast Chilean underclass. The indigenous origins of the rotos were obvious at Allende's political demonstrations. Dressed in indigenous clothes, their affinity with their indigenous neighbors would have been apparent. The same could be said of the cabezas negras, black heads, who came out to support Perón. So throughout the 20th century and the early 21st century, you had movements that were pro-indigenous, as well as being anti-capitalist, or at the very least, focused on reforming capitalism to fit a more equal society. And those movements were targeted not just by capitalists, but by racial capitalists, by a white settler elite, who not only looked at this as the working class rising up, but who had a very distinct racial profile of those people. And those people had a very distinct racial understanding of themselves as well. Being brown and being black in many cases, that's the whole thing. As Danae notes, the figure of the Roto Chileno is quite a thing in Chilean history, right? In the 1800s, there was a lot of pro-indigenous movements in Latin America inspired by Simón Bolívar to not interfere with indigenous movements, to incorporate and work alongside indigenous peoples to varying degrees in a movement that would be against imperialism. But God knows that almost immediately this strain of progressive thought disappears from the record. Political leaders who sought to be friendly with the indigenous peoples were replaced by those anxious to participate in the global campaign to exterminate indigenous peoples. The British had already embarked on that task in Australia and South Africa, and the French took part after 1830 when they invaded Algeria. Latin America soon joined in. The purposeful extermination of indigenous peoples in the 19th century may well have been on a larger scale than anything attempted by the Spanish and the Portuguese in the earlier colonial period. This is a fascinating argument. Millions of indigenous people died because of a lack of immunity to European diseases, yet the early colonists needed the Indians to grow food and to provide laborers. They did not have the same economic necessity to make the land free from Indians that would provoke the extermination campaigns on other continents from the same era. The true Latin American Holocaust occurred in the 19th century. Think about how big this claim is, which is a very justifiable claim. When you compare it with the story we're given about Latinos, the story we're given about Latin America, which is they were colonized by Spain and then they got their freedom from Spain. And since then, there's a lot of corruption and poverty, but Latin peoples are strong and they rise up. There's a great song by Calle 13 called Latino America that makes me cry every time I listen to it. And I think it does a great job of presenting a vision of Latin American peoples as from all these diverse backgrounds, representing all these many things, having all this passion and all this life and all this history, despite the evils committed to them by Western imperialism. It's a very compelling narrative, and it's one that's not untruthful in many senses, but it is not the whole truth. It is in fact very far from the whole truth in a way that is easily manipulable by white and light-skinned mestizo Latinos. Next, Lasso. I worked as an interpreter for ICE years ago. It was so awkward when they asked every Latino about their race and ethnicity. And after pretending they'd never heard of a mestizo, they'd mark them as black or brown or whatever they wanted to mark them as. And that's how race really is, right? Race is extremely subjective. It is something, it's in terms of whiteness especially, that can be given and taken away. Certain people are white in certain contexts and not white in other contexts. When you are considered brown or black, though, that is a key part of considering you other. Sometimes you're considered brown, not because your skin is darker than a particular person, not because you have the darkest skin among all the peoples of your population, but because of what you do, right? Because of what you represent. And so, yes, skin color and racism ultimately is a huge fulcrum here. And it also speaks to the arbitrariness of pseudoscience like race. I used to love Calle 13 until he got NC Black talking about hip-hop on Twitter. It sucks. Calle 13 is a very flawed person. Residente, I should say, is a very flawed person. He has at times stood up very strongly for certain social justice causes and at times has missed the mark on race. I think especially, speaking of J Balvin, when it came to his tearing J Balvin apart a couple of years ago in a beef, I think a lot of that was his concentrated fury of all the learning that he had to do about race, him taking it out on J Balvin, somebody who did not do that learning. Right. It's a whole conversation. Joaquin Becerra says, I'm Chilean and my dad works in a low-income school. Even though both of us have dark skin, in low-income communities we are white. He was told as much by his students. That's the arbitrariness of race, right? Especially in terms of demarcation of who is or isn't a part of the right class. People talk about class struggle. Race is a huge part of class. It's exactly as that Argentinian woman said in the street. It's interwoven. Part of being a part of the upper class and the ruling class is being at least spiritually white. Being somebody who has light enough skin, who lightens their skin a specific way, and who aligns with European beauty standards, who aligns with European cultural standards, right? Ideals. Tupac se llama Tupac por Tupac Amaru de Peru. Yes, exactly. Residente of Calle 13. Yes, we always forget about, I keep forgetting. I forgot the name of the other member of Calle 13. Anyway, yeah, Calle 13, fascinating conversation, right? Possible bat. As a Spanish person, this is a very important conversation to hear from me because I have this warped view of Hispanidad, Latinidad, visitante, thank you, that I feel like very few people have. Yeah, in Spain, Latin America is seen as spicy. It's seen as brown a lot of the times. It's seen as that kind of other culture of which Spanish people find fascination and equal parts judgment. I have had friends who are brown, indigenous and black mixed, who have lived in Spain and have told me that they've been called sudaca, which is a slur for South American people. And this is another really interesting part about white supremacy in Latin America. is because a lot of white Latinos will get away with portraying themselves as the brown other. Sometimes they will say things like, we are the true Americans. And it's like, I get what you're trying to say, man, but like, you're white, you're European. Like, you are not the true Americans. If anybody is the true Americans, it's the indigenous peoples, whether it's in the United States, in Canada, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in Guatemala, whether it's in Colombia, whether it's in Chile. Those are the people that would have the claim for the true Americans, right? Regardless, there's a lot of this animosity towards Europe and the United States. A lot of this animosity that European Latin Americans will have. And they will align that animosity with people's movements. But in actuality, it's jealousy. In actuality, is that these people feel like they are lesser Europeans because they live in Latin America. And their whole thing is not, oh yeah, I care so much about indigenous rights. I care so much about illegal mining in the Amazon. Their whole thing is that we should get more money and investment in Latin America. We should get more, peace in Latin America. Vague abstractions. They will see Latin America as this project that could be just as good as Europe if only people would just stop being so backwards in Latin America. Oftentimes it's based on the very same racism that they're claiming to be against, because these are the same kinds of Latinos that will look negatively upon their own people, quote unquote, because of the ways that certain black and brown people act, because of hood people. Yales in Puerto Rico, right, is a term that is used for usually brown or dark-skinned or even black Puerto Rican women who are hood, who are ghetto, quote unquote. This is the terminology. So a lot of these people, don't let them fool you, okay? Don't let these white Latinos fool you. A lot of these people will talk about Operación Condor. Well, I won't say a lot of these people. Some of these people will get online and talk about Operación Condor. And it's like, bro, the people who did Operación Condor were your parents. You know what I mean? Like, that was the people your parents voted for. That's the same ethnic group. That's the same economic group. That's the same political affiliation that you've benefited from. That would be like somebody being like, yo, the devastation that was wrought upon me as an American in the United States by, Tuskegee vaccines, Jim Crow or whatever. And it's like, but you're a white American. Do you know what I mean? Like, what do you mean? Oh, I could go on and on about this. I recommend highly to check out Richard Gott's work, but if you want to talk about the genocide is a very prevalent topic in cultural discourse right now for various reasons. You want to talk about people doing genocide? White Latinos did genocide. I do mean white Latinos because these are the same people that would pass themselves off as white Latinos. But in reality, they were Europeans who, for instance, in Chile and Argentina, committed systematic extermination of the Selknam people, one of 4 indigenous peoples of Tierra del Fuego archipelago. I'm getting crossed up. I don't speak enough Spanish to be this expert at this. This is a Wikipedia summary. During the late 19th century, European and South American livestock companies affiliated with the Chilean and Argentinian governments began to establish estancias, large ranches, on the Isla Grande de Tierra del Fuego, which along with the Tierra del Fuego gold rush displaced the indigenous population and heavily disrupted their traditional way of life. Livestock companies paid their employees and third-party hunters, such as Julius Popper, to kill or capture Selknam people. Make no mistake, this is European genocide of Americans. And the fact that you can say they're Chileans, they're South Americans, is part of the kind of brushing over or mixing up that makes these conversations more difficult than they have to be. Indigenous genocide in Argentina. I highly recommend this artist named Milo J from Argentina because he's put out this album. He's this young dude. He's put out this album that draws a lot from both hip hop and like folklorico and R&B. And he speaks, about indigeneity in his music. You can see that there's clear themes of indigeneity. He has a song called Bajo de la Piel, and it's on this indigenous land in Argentina. There was indigenous genocide and there is indigenous genocide in Argentina that was perpetuated by Argentinian state policies. Again, just to hammer home, like, who are these people that are shaping Latin America? Agostino Rocha, or Roca, was an Italo-Argentine businessman. This guy was part of Mussolini's cabinet. He was made part of the Istituto por la Ricostruzione Industriale, a public holding company. He distanced himself from Mussolini in 1941. He broke with the regime. He joined the British-sponsored opposition group. Then he was arrested in Milan in 1945. Then, in 1949, he got a contract from Comodoro Rivadavia to build a 1,600-kilometer gas pipeline in Argentina by Juan Perón. And he became a leading government contractor, this Italian man. This company that conducted this construction is named Tech Int. And Tech Int is one of the biggest companies in Argentina, one of the most prolific companies in Argentina. There's a whole Wikipedia article about genocide of indigenous peoples of the Americas that includes several ones that took place post-independence, okay? Not by the Spanish, not by the United States, but by the white settlers from Europe, the Europeans that dominated in Latin America over indigenous peoples of Latin America. Putumayo genocide, okay? This was in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. There was an ethnocide of the indigenous population in the Putumayo region. It was over rubber. Classic story. It was primarily perpetrated by Peruvian rubber baron Julio Cesar Arana during the Amazon rubber boom from 1879 to 1911. So this is, a huge, devastating genocide that was committed against indigenous peoples in Peru that was part of the same processes that lead to ethnic cleansing, or that are part and parcel of ethnic cleansing in Latin America today. Over materials, over resources. This is Julio Cesar Arana. He was Peruvian, right? Was he Huitoto? Was he Bora? No, this guy is descended from Spanish people. He's a white guy. Again, like everywhere you look, for all of the problems that happen in Latin America and all the problems that plague Latinos, what we know as Latinos worldwide, everywhere you look, there is a white Latino there with a beard and a lot of money. And nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about how it's the same exact settler colonial dynamic we've been talking about in Israel. The same exact historical dynamic that we talk about with white supremacy in the United States. The only difference is that these countries weren't as successful in exterminating as many indigenous people and didn't make as much money as the United States has. You can have a whole conversation about the crossover when it comes to the Guatemalan genocide of Mayans. Guatemala, as many people probably know, Guatemala committed the silent Holocaust, the Mayan genocide, between 1960 and 1996. This is talked about as one of the evils of the United States, and it absolutely is that. Do not take me as somebody doing apologia for the United States government for the CIA. Absolutely not. But it's not as if there were zero people living in Guatemala who benefited from it. They were settlers. They were Europeans, just like the same European settlers that make up the upper classes of the United States historically, okay? We are talking about hundreds of thousands of Mayans killed by a US-backed Guatemalan military government and by local militias. And anti-Mayan sentiment is still a huge problem in Guatemala to this day, as is land rights. So this is the conversation. Danae. Chilean history filled with traditional native names like Alessandri or Recabarren. Yeah, even Salvador Allende was descended from Europeans, right? Like much of what we understand a Chilean or an Argentinian person to be is just a European who has been living in the Americas for a long time, speaks a European language, Spanish, and maybe has 5 or 10% indigenous blood, quote unquote. And it's like, come on, are we talking the same thing? It's like the same thing as white Americans being like, I'm 6% Cherokee. Although sometimes they're making that shit up. Sometimes the white Latinos are making that shit up too. White Americans will sometimes, I'm actually a little bit indigenous in my blood, It's whitewashing. It's very literally whitewashing. Chile and Argentina are not white places historically. They've become that through European settler colonialism. And until we have that conversation, we're not going to be able to talk about Latinos for Trump. We're not going to be able to have a constructive conversation about Latinos for Trump. We're not going to be able to have a full conversation about anti-blackness among Latin American communities. We're not going to be able to have a robust conversation about imperialism because, we can see these processes play out now in many different ways. There are Latinos. There are predominantly white Latinos who are part of the upper classes of Latin America who are aligning themselves with revolutionary sentiment, quote unquote. Who talk this big game about anti-imperialism, who talk this big game about their people, who talk this big game about our resources and Yankees and gringos. But in reality, they're using that to get rich. They're using that to build social credibility. Danae brought up Grupo Luksic in the chat. Grupo Luksic is one of the biggest economic groups in Chile. Economic groups is a whole other conversation, right? Obviously, the name derives from the Balkans. And Grupo Luksic is one of the biggest donors to the center-left in Chile. There is no rise of center-left politicians in Chile without significant donations from Grupo Luksic in a lot of cases, to the point where it's basically the same thing as anti-George Soros sentiments in the United States. You remember throughout the 2000s when Fox News was always talking about, George Soros. The Democrats, they want our country to be dominated by George Soros. That whole thing, similar things happen in Chile. In Chile, it's, the Luksics. The Luksics are going to dominate our country. The Luksics want to take over our country. Meanwhile, it's capitalists taking over your country, making this argument. It's fascinating, isn't it? And last point, Yamaha Tracer MT points out, I'm even more sad because my mom said she wouldn't vote for Jara because she's a communist. Anti-communism is racial. I don't know if people are ready to have that conversation. Maybe in 2026. Anti-communism is a very racialized thing, because if the communists succeed and they truly enact, their vision, even in small reforms, which, get it straight, like, Jeanette Jara was not about to, cause armed revolution against the capitalists of Chile, right? She's part of the Communist Party, but she really maps on to being like a social democrat. Regardless, what they want is essentially for brown people and black people to have more money. And you can't have that. Might be worth looking into Julia Chunil and how national media, owned in part by Luke Six, were disastrous in covering it. Oh, Luke Six plays both sides of this, but I actually don't know about Julia Chunil, so I will take a look at that. This is the conversation. Again, without conversating about settler colonialism and white supremacy, we're not talking about Latinos. We're not. And I say that as a Latino. I say that as a Dominican. Speaking of white settler colonial projects, the Dominican Republic exists specifically because Europeans were like, cannot let Haitians have any power. We've got to build a strong settler colony of white people on Hispaniola to keep dominion over Haitians on the island. And to this day, you'll see even black and brown Dominicans, like that motherfucker Alofoque, who are like, Haitians have to be deported, they have to be kicked off the island, this should be our island. Haitians are evil, Haitians eat people, they eat dogs, all this shit. Look around the world and you will find the same dynamics that play out in your own community. There are remixes and interesting variations. There are interesting variables that get put into play, and people are at different points in a cyclical movement. So some people are just in their come up of adding more social safety nets, and some people are just in their neoliberal era in certain respects, right? When you look throughout history. But regardless, the story remains the same. Caste is the story. Caste is the story throughout the world. It is class struggle mapped onto a historical struggle beyond the capitalist idea of class. Class struggle has been always a part of the world in the lens of caste. People who have specific affiliations as being the privileged people of the state, the privileged people by the elites themselves, and all these different categories of people beneath them. That's how it works.